We'll just give it another minute for everyone to join in. All right, let's start. A warm welcome to everyone. I'm Dr. Nikhil Khadbari, work with Ekleva MedTech as the Chief Medical Officer. So today we'll be talking about real-world evidence and how it's transforming cardiovascular devices. So why this topic now? I think probably in the era of technology and artificial intelligence, we may now have the right tools for the rules. May not be the rules just yet, but we are definitely seeing the right tools being developed to look at the data and the evidence out there. Um, so just I'll talk briefly about where we come from. Ekleva MedTech is a mid-sized CRO. We operate out of EU in France. So this was founded in October 2020. We do pre-market and post-market clinical trials, and we provide consultancy for medical devices across the globe. We also have our in-house clinical trials software platform, which is Milo Health, which is AI-enabled electronic data capture platform, which I'll touch upon later and talk on how it helps collect real-world evidence data. So we are spread across different therapeutic areas. So cardiology is one of our prime area where we are present with global presence, especially in the EU as well. Orthopedics, by background, I'm an orthopedic and spine surgeon, so I bring this expertise to the table, as well as wound care. So with this, I'd like to hand it over to my other colleagues. We have a stellar team today. We have Dr. Eugene and Dr. Matthias Fink. I'm fortunate enough to be joined by other clinicians as well who have sort of agreed to talk or touch upon real world evidence. Handing it over to Dr. Yu. I'll just stop sharing. Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Nika, for the introduction. So I'm Eugene. I'm currently a clinical manager from a notified body in Belgium. Today it's my pleasure here to share you some insights from a notified body perspective on the real-world evidence for the cardiovascular devices. I will share my screen now. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
We can see your screen. I think if you just make it full screen, yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So my background is a cardiologist. I'm specializing in cardiovascular devices. I have more than 20 years experience in clinical evaluation, clinical investigation, clinical trials related with cardiovascular devices. And in the past 5 years, I've been working at a notified body. So let's have a look together, begin with clarifying the terminology of real-world data. It refers to the data that are related to the healthcare records and healthcare information collected from various sources. And when we analyze this data, we draw clinical conclusions. It becomes a real-world evidence. Many regulatory authorities, as you can see from here, from FDA, MHRA, of course, including EU, recognize the value of real-world evidence. There are also many initiatives to support the usage of real-world evidence for the conformity assessment purpose. Real-world evidence will be acceptable to support regulatory decisions if they are collected properly and of good quality. So real-world evidence or real-world data can come from many different sources. A few examples you can see here, including device registry, patient or disease registry, service, electronic health records, and also nowadays many information coming from the digital health technologies. So these sources provide a rich foundation for generating real-world evidence that reflects the real clinical practice. And from the EU MDR perspective, under the MDR Article 248, according to the definition of clinical data, real-world evidence is recognized as a valid source for the clinical evidence. This is reflected in the third and fourth bulletin point, as you see here, under the definition of clinical data in MDR. So, real-world evidence can come from the published literatures on the clinical experience collected from the device under evaluation or from the equivalent device. It, of course, can also come from the post-market surveillance phase. What should be noted here is that for the high-risk Class 3 device or implantable devices that's not previously certified under MDD, in general, clinical investigation is required and expected, with the exception that if the device under evaluation fall under the well-established technology list under the MDR Article 616b. So pre-market data is often limited in scope, as we all know. Normally, it's limited in the number of patients and in the range of patients that are available. The duration of pre-market studies are relatively short, and often this data are collected in experienced centers with a very controlled setting. It's include limited clinical or disease conditions. While in the real-world post-market experience, the device will be exposed to the users with different experience. It will be used in a large range of patients with different severity of the disease and comorbidities. It allows us to collect the safety and effectiveness of the device through the entire life cycle of the device. So this broad perspective is essential for the understanding of the long-term safety and performance of the device in the more complex real-world settings. From the clinical and the regulatory perspective, clinical investigation and real-world evidence both have their strengths and limitations. So they are complementary methods to each other, and it's important for us to consider the approach, to choose the approach that fits for the purpose. So clinical investigation on the one side, of course, offers scientific rigorousness and controlled, provide high quality data, allow to minimize the bias. And it's also allowed to control for confounders and to address a specific question and hypothesis, particularly in a head-to-head comparison setting, while the real-world evidence allowed to collect the data from the full spectrum of the patients is often observational in nature, but it's allowed to expose the device to the real-world situation, and it's a cost-effective way to get a large number of data. So often we are facing the question when a clinical investigation, especially randomized controlled trial, is required. So normally for a highly innovative device, such as a device the first of its kind, there's no similar device on the market, and there's also great uncertainty around the benefit risks for the device in comparison with the alternative treatment. In such a situation, you need to consider a randomized controlled study for the pre-market approval. And another scenario to consider is when the performance of the device is highly impacted by many confounders. I will offer you an example here that is a renal denervation catheter. It's a device used to treat resistant or uncontrolled hypertension patients via an invasive procedure. So the alternative treatment, of course, it's a medical treatment with medicines. It is a highly innovative technique, and there are also additional risks related with the catheter and the procedure itself compared with the traditional medication treatment. And the outcome itself, that is the reduction of the blood pressure level, is highly impacted by many confounders, such as the lifestyle of the patients, the medication that the patients are taking, and the comorbidities that the patient has. In such a situation, a randomized controlled trial will be considered as a appropriate method to collect the pre-market data and to get a market approval for such device. So now let's have a look of the typical type of real-world evidence that you could use to collect the real-world evidence. So registry is one of the powerful tools that it's a system that uses observational study method to collect defined clinical data under the normal conditions of use of the device to evaluate the specific outcomes for a population. Registry can be set up by the manufacturer or can be a public registry set up for different reasons. It allows to collect information for the devices or multiple devices, and it's provided very valuable information, especially for high-risk device and implantable devices. So in 2023, there is a systematic review published highlighting the value and the quality of cardiovascular registry and orthopedic registries for collecting real-world evidence. And it advocates developing comprehensive and trustworthy medical device registry. This will be add tremendous value not only for approval of medical device under medical device regulation, but also for healthcare professional and patients to support an evidence-based medicine, support evidence-based choice of devices, and contribute to the long-term safety and efficacy of the device. And here I presented two examples as for the cardiovascular registry. The first example you can see here is the Sweetheart registry. It's a registry comprised of several registries within it, and one of them is for the coronary stents in SCAR registry. This collected all the stents implanted in Sweden between the years into 2000. It allows the patient level and segment level analysis for provide safety performance information of different stents, the benefit-risk ratios, and very important also provide SOTA information for the comparison among different stents. The second example is here from the TIVI registry. Those are one of the ESC, the European Society of Cardiology registries from the Euro Observational Research Program. This registry also allowed to have the long-term data for the TAVI implants. And another useful tool that I want to discuss with you here is the survey. Survey as a tool it has its convenience, it's cost-effective and less burdensome methods for collecting real-world data. It's flexible in the design, so it can be prospective or retrospective in design. It's especially suitable for certain devices, such as a relatively lower risk device with indirect clinical benefits and does not have, let's say, a measurable direct treatment effects. Of course, survey also has its limitations to consider. It might subject to selection bias and is of course offer less scientific rigorousness. It may face the challenging of missing data or lower response rate. And in addition, it's worth to consider that for patient data survey, consent may be needed from the patients, and often is not sufficient for pre-market approval in EU unless it's published data. Another example that I can offer is the retrospective study. Retrospective study is using pre-existing data, such as the information from the medical record of the patients, registries, or hospital data, to evaluate the performance, safety, or the clinical outcome of the device that has been already used in a patient. It's also a very cost-effective method to gather data, and it's allowed to quickly gather a relatively large number of data in comparison with prospective studies. It's also at a minimal burden and risk to the patients, since the device has been already used or implanted in the patients. And of course, it has certain limitations. For example, it can be incomplete or missing data. The, the documentation that are available might have not very good quality. It also not able to allow the controlled collection timelines because the retrospective data may be collected according to the clinical practice at different timelines, and there may be not standardized measurements or methods used to collecting this data. And we also need to consider there are some variations in clinical practice in different geographic regions. So retrospective study can be very useful to bridge the gap in clinical data for legacy device, especially for the transition from the MDD to the MDR, and it will add strength to the device or to the study if the manufacturer is able to publish the results. So here I would like to show two examples of the real-world evidence contributed to the conformity assessment for the specific device. The first example I would like to give is cardiovascular guide wire. So this is class 3 non-implantable device for transient use in the procedure. Such device does not have a direct clinical benefits or treatment effects. This device is CE marked on the MDD without performing a clinical investigation previously. It has been already on the market for more than 5 years. So besides the normal PMS data, compliance and the vigilance data, in order to bridge the gap from the MDD to MDR transition, PMCF survey can be a very useful method. It captures the useful information of the guidewire itself, including the procedure success and the feedback from the cardiologist, the users, on the performance of a guidewire itself, such as the steerability and trackability. And those are the endpoints that can be collected from a survey from the questions rather than directly measured from the procedure itself. The second example I would like to give is coronary stents. So the device under evaluation is a class 3 implantable stent. It is a modification of the previous generation of the stent. The previous generation of the stent, the manufacturer has performed clinical investigation of the stent and published results. So the stent has been relying on the equivalent device. So as we all know, MDR has put a lot of emphasis on the post-market clinical follow-up activities, and the PMCF registry for the stents in this scenario is a good choice to fulfill the PMCF requirement. It allows to gather real-world information from a large number of patients that actually using the stents meeting the requirements for the PMCF activities on the MDR. So to summarize what has been discussed so far, that real-world evidence plays a very important role in the regulatory compliance under the EU MDR requirement, and it can be used to supply the existing data for MDR application for the legacy device, and it also can be an important sources to meet the requirement of PMCF activities and for the long-term safety and monitoring. What is important to consider is to select a method that fits for the purpose for the specific device and take into consideration the characteristic of the device and the gap in the existing data. And it's important to focus on the data quality from the real-world evidence that are gathered and the completeness of the data. Whenever possible, of course, if you can publish the data, it will add the value and to the robustness of the data. So, having said that, this is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. If you would like to connect, here is my LinkedIn profile. And now I will hand the stage to the next speaker to discuss further of this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation, and quickly take over the screen, and then we go to the second presentation. I hope you can see my screen now. Let me know if you don't. Great. Yeah, as we already heard a lot of the notified body perspective. Now you're going to hear a little bit more, probably a bit more freely from the consultant perspective, since we don't have these restrictions, what we can say out loud and what not, than a notified body has. Quickly myself, Matthias Fink is my name. I'm a managing consultant with Aqua Team, which is a consulting company based out of Germany and the US. And I'm also a physician by training, and I also worked 7 years as a reviewer for a notified body. So I really, have seen from different perspectives. And what we do at Aqua Team, we are a consulting company, like a small boutique consulting firm. We are doing regulatory, clinical, and quality management consulting. And we help manufacturers, small or large manufacturers, to get the devices on the market. Especially right now, we have a lot of our clients to make a transition from MDD to MDR, and as you're all aware, the clinical restrictions have become a little bit more higher. So you now need clinical data also for legacy devices. Some devices got up-classified. Some devices are now come under the higher scrutiny by notified bodies. So a lot of manufacturers in the transition phase for the legacy devices, which are currently marketed under MDD and AI MDD, are still a bit struggling because they're now realizing, okay, we probably need clinical data, especially since the equivalence demonstration has become so much more stringent under the MDR. So real-world evidence really is something that's not only relevant for new devices, but a lot of manufacturers with legacy devices currently rely or trying to rely on real-world evidence because the device is used for so many years in so many countries to successfully make the transition from MDD to MDR. Yeah, we briefly talked about this in the previous presentation. What are the definitions? One of the earliest I found is from 2017 from an IMDRF guidance on software as a medical device, which defines the real-world data as product information that is gathered when the device or the product or the device is used in the actual clinical setting in the routine medical practice. The important thing is, and I think the very important difference between what we heard in the previous presentation about, okay, clinical study and the real-world evidence. We all know the limitations of a clinical study, especially pre-market studies. Most of them are monocenter studies. They are not multi-center studies. Very few devices, just not feasible, are investigated in a randomized controlled trial. Everything gets standard if you talk about trials for new drugs. They all have to undergo randomized controlled trials compared to either a placebo or another approved drug for the same indication. We rarely see this in medical devices. And the problem is, we all know that a lot of these pre-market or even post-market PMCF studies are done at, let's say, these high-level volume centers, let's say hospitals, physicians who do this procedure quite regularly. But what's going to happen if the device is going to get used, let's say, by the more routine or real-world setting? If it gets used by multiple hospitals, smaller community-based hospitals, who probably don't have the expertise because they're just not doing it a high number of procedures. And we still, of course, want to make sure, and every manufacturer wants to make sure that the device will not only be performing well in the high experienced user, but also in the, let's say, less experienced user, because there should be no negative impact for a patient if he goes to a smaller hospital compared to, let's say, a bigger hospital. So this is why the data is so important, and this is why I think real-world data and real-world evidence becomes so much more important. And there's also the one thing: there's real-world data, there's real-world evidence. It still gets confused sometimes by people. So if you look at real-world data, and this is the definition from the FDA, is very similar to what we see with the IMDRF. It's basically data collected in the setting, in the clinical use, everyday use. But it also provides some examples here. It could be electronic health records, medical claims databases, registries. So we hear registries here as well, and other sources. So there's digital health technologies. Especially the last couple of years, everyone now has, let's say, a smartwatch, or most people have a smartwatch or other using health apps or technologies that's collecting data. So I think we are still at the, let's say, beginning of the possibilities we're going to see in the future with real-world evidence and real-world data. So this is real-world data. So what is real-world evidence? As that some people are still confusing it. Real-world data is basically just the raw data. So if you have a smartwatch like an Apple Watch, and this is, let's say, collecting, I don't know, data on your, I think it's feasible now since the last update, blood oxygen. You can do some EKG testing. It also now, I think, collects data on your blood pressure. So this is something, this is only the raw data. This is the real world data. And then basically, if you use the data, compute it into something, analyze the data, then you get the real world evidence. And this is what you need at the end to show to regulators like the FDA or notified bodies in Europe what your device can do, and that you really have the clinical evidence to show safety and performance of your device and show the positive clinical benefit. We already saw that, and so we saw already now IMDRF has a definition. The FDA has a definition. What does Europe do? We have the new regulation, the MDR, just published in 2017, came into force in 2021. So you would expect that EU MDR already talked about real-world evidence. Unfortunately, no, if you look at, and we saw this slide before, the definition in Article 2 of the MDR, it says clinical investigation, it says reports published, it says equivalence, it also says post-market, but real-world evidence or real-world data does not in any way is not mentioned in all those 200, I think 70-something pages of the EU MDR. Only if you look at one of these guidance documents, the MDCG 2020-6, that talks about, and this is exactly the MDCG guidance document that facilitates the transition of legacy devices which are currently under the old directive marketed to make a transition into the EU MDR. And as one of the possible data sources, this MDCG talks about real-world data and then bringing in registries, insurance databases, records, and whatnot. So then at least it's not a definition of the MDR, it's an MDCG guidance. So notified bodies are bound to follow these. And it looks like a definition is very similar, and they might even get this from the MDCG working group from the FDA definition. We already saw some examples. Here's some other examples specifically for cardiovascular devices. Registries, I think, is a very, very good example. My background is more also like Nikhil, more from the orthopedic and less from the cardiovascular side. Even I've had some cardiovascular training myself as being a physician. But we see a lot of very good registries. Some of them are very long-standing. There's the NCDR registry from the American College of Cardiology. They have various subset registries that capture, let's say, data on ICDs, TAVI procedures, for example, also stent procedures. And some of these sub-registries, let's say from the overall NCDR, also collects, let's say, follow-up data, let's say, maybe, I don't know, post-procedural 6 weeks, 3 months, up to 1 year. So it's clearly going to help manufacturers to collect some form of the data. Usually these registries, there's also the German aortic valve registry. We saw the Swedish registry earlier. They collect usually more procedure-related data, and of course, adverse events and side effects is going to happen during the procedure and also follow up in the procedure. What a lot of these registries are lacking, unfortunately, is patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs, which a lot of notified bodies expect to see as the performance data, really patient-related data, and especially if you need, as a manufacturer under the EU MDR, show the positive clinical benefit of your device. A lot of these benefits are related to patient-reported outcome data, like, I don't know, patient scores, pain scores, or whatnot. And then you need to have this data. So the registry might be a very good data source. It might not help you with all the questions you need to answer. Which brings us to the second topic here, is the device manufacturer registries. That, of course, is a registry usually set up in the post-market phase after the device already approved. The manufacturer basically setting up his own registry. Some of them exist in collaboration with specific hospitals or hospital systems. We've seen this in the US. So they're going to track, let's say, their own number of patients. And then, of course, if you as a manufacturer set up or co-sponsor your own registry, you have the huge benefit that you basically can determine, okay, that's the data I'm going to need, because I probably might have a condition on my certificate that I need to conduct a specific PMCF study with a certain number of endpoints, or you know exactly where you probably have some gaps in clinical data, and then you can define and help to shape the design of the registry and make sure you get the endpoints you're going to need. Real-world electronic health records. This is, of course, all the data that's collected in the hospital. I was working as a physician myself for 17 years. There's a multitude of data that's going to get collected. The problem is a lot of them are not very sorted, especially now the last couple of years, everything now is becoming more and more electronic. And depending on the hospital, they might have specific protocols for exactly what type of data they collect. Also, like patient-reported outcome data, except maybe for pain scores, not really collected. So you're not going to get, let's say, in patients standardized after, let's say, they got the PCI and the coronary stent. They usually not routinely get, let's say, a NUA score, for example. So you still might have the problem. You have to go through all the data. A lot of them is not very, as I said, sorted out. It could be very messy, depending what physicians are consider relevant to put in there. So it might be a data source, but again, you have to look at the data very carefully. You need to decide, okay, that's the data I'm going to need, and always make sure that you're able to close the gaps you're having, because notified bodies, yes, they appreciate if you have the real-world data source, but they also expect that you use a data source that help you close any data gaps you're going to have. It's not sufficient to just say, oh, we use real-world evidence and then come up with, let's say, a registry that has data, but it's probably not providing the data you're really going to need. Administrative claims databases, insurance and billing or whatever databases, that's probably more a thing in the US, because with all the data protection, GDPR and whatnot in Europe, it's very difficult to get that type of data. So we see this more coming from the US. They also have serious limitations because they're usually focusing more on this length of stay in the hospital, any complications that probably lead to an extended length of stay, any readmission. They usually don't have any long-term follow-up data. So it's not really something that's helping, especially for any permanent implant, for getting long-term data. It might provide some information on the short-term data. And if you know, okay, you have a certain procedure that has a very high risk of, let's say, short-term within the first couple of weeks, risk of certain side effects, it might be helpful. But it's certainly not the holy grail that's going to solve all your problems. I already briefly spoke about patient-generated data and variables. We see this more and more now in the US. A lot of, especially orthopedic field procedures, are now done in outpatient setting where patients basically get released after 1 day. They use apps, they use websites where they basically have to provide their own data, let's say, provide pain scores and whatnot. We see now more and more even patients getting sensors or get any other variables. Let's say they collect data permanently. So we're going to get a huge amount of data, as always, plus also these all implantable devices like pacemakers, ICDs, who collect myriads of data points every day. The problem is privacy, patient privacy. Does the manufacturer get access to that type of data? What type of data he can get? What to do with all the data needs to be analyzed and whatnot. I think there are a lot of possibilities, but we're only, I think, a very little step into that. And that's really something that's probably becoming more and more important in the future, because we're going to see, now, not even talking about AI, but we're going to see more and more now apps and whatnot, which are related to postoperative follow-up with patients and helping patients, and especially with all these wearable devices. So I think it's a big opportunity, but the question is, okay, how do we get, as a manufacturer, access to that type of data, and what can we do with the data to provide it in a format that's useful and helpful to show conformity with the requirements of, as in either the FDA, Europe, or any other markets. So I think when we look at the real-world data or real-world evidence, what we really need to look at, and it's really a thing is important, is the suitability. I already brought this up. There might be possibilities, even in the pre-market setting, it might be more challenging, especially in the EU MDR. We saw this previously. Implantable Class 3 devices, a clinical investigation is basically always required unless you can rely on existing data, which could be challenging in the real-world setting. Post-market, I think it's a big thing, probably more for the post-market clinical follow-up. But also, as I said this previously, you have to align with your state of the art. If you're talking about EU MDR, you need to define certain safety and performance endpoints based on the state of the art in your clinical evaluation. And you have to make sure that the data you collect in the post-market setup are aligned with these relevant endpoints in the state of the art. So you have to make sure that the registry or the health record, whatever you're using, provides you that output that you're going to need to be aligned with your own clinical evaluation. You have to make sure, as that to cover the devices, number of devices, the duration, especially for long-term implants. Notified bodies expects that we provide the clinical data over the lifetime of the device. So you have to make sure these real-world data sources are not just, let's say, if you have a heart valve, usually notified bodies expect up to 10 years of data and follow-up at some point. So you have to make sure you're not going to stop collecting data after 1 year. Data quality is very important. And also transferability, because, and I will have some examples. What are you going to do? Let's say if you have a device which already is approved in the US, you're collecting real-world evidence data in the US, and you might consider, okay, using that data going into Europe. So transferability is very, very important. Luckily, both the FDA and the EU MDR accepts clinical data that comes from other regions. So as long as you follow, let's say, good clinical practice, GCP or ISO 14155, it's feasible to use that data collected there, as long as you can justify to transfer the data to your region, let's say the US or European population, to use that data from outside real-world evidence sources. A couple of things, of course, you need to consider. I'm not going to go to fully detail here, but just to give you an idea. You always need to consider, okay, there are differences between different populations anatomically, physiologically. Let's say, look at an Asian population, look at the European or an American population. There could be differences in the height and the weight of these average of these populations. So you probably have a different type of size implant than in one than in the other region. It's probably not as relevant in the cardiovascular field, but in the orthopedic field where I come from, it's quite often that you have different size ranges, let's say in a Japanese study compared to a European study. Also like work habits, lifestyle habits, something that we'll need to consider. Very important is, okay, standard of care. Are the patients, let's say, in different regions treated the same way? There are, if you look, especially sometimes, there are common guidelines between American and European expert societies, but there are also different indications or conditions that are treated differently. So at the end, and this is what you need to show to the notified body, you have to show them, okay, the patient population, let's say, that's treated in the US are very similar, let's say, when it comes to the indications, when it comes to the patient demographics, when it comes to the standard of care to the patient in Europe, and then you can be able to use that type of data. What doesn't play a role, and we talk about the European Union, which are 27 member states right now, they have very a lot of differences, especially when it comes to healthcare systems, sometimes even standard of care. But that doesn't matter. As long as you collect data in the EU for the European Union, for the EU MDR, you're safe. Even if you might have some more differences between certain European member states than compared to an outside of the Union state. To provide some examples, the US published in 2019 this list of examples, this 90 examples for 510K de novo and even pre-market approvals, meaning talking about class 2 and class 3 devices. I couldn't find an updated version, so I think it is still the latest they're having. But these are examples where the FDA basically accepted real-world evidence, at least partially, as clinical data. One example is left ventricular assist device. As you can see, they used the real-world data source was the INTERMAX registry, which is the big US registry that basically collects data on all patients that require mechanically assisted circulatory support, which is usually an LVAD or a BiVAD or even a total artificial heart. And they use basically part of the data, as you can see, is from a non-real-world evidence cohort, but also the majority of patients, nearly 500 patients treated in a 2-year time span were coming up from this real-world evidence data source, this INTERMAX registry, and this basically helped the manufacturer to get the approval for that device. They also were required to do a post-market study, which completely used data from the INTERMAX registry. So the manufacturer was not required to set up their own post-market study because there is basically a mandatory registry for every patient who requires circulatory support for left ventricular heart failure is registered and collected in the INTERMAX registry. They could use that data completely for their post-market requirements. A second example is a truck-eluting stent. Approved a couple of years ago. Also nothing new, but it was a new type of thing, I think, of truck that was used. This type, it was a registry set up by the manufacturer. The manufacturer basically, after they got the device approved in, I think, in Europe, so they used, they did a clinical study, as you can see here, with 2,300 patients, but they also had additional 2,349 patients, which they got from their real-world evidence registry. So they basically were able to double the number of patients when they applied for a PMA with the FDA. And as I said, you can also see their follow-up duration here was up to 3 years. So this really was the possibility, since there was a manufacturer set up registry, they really could tailor the registry and all the endpoints they're going to need for themselves. What is Europe doing? As it is a little bit more stringent, it's a little bit more stricter with the definitions. There was this core MD project that ran between 2021 and 2024. It was EU funded. It was set up with a lot of people from regulatory side, from the clinical side, from hospitals. There is a big need, and if you talk to the medical community, everyone wants to see more clinical evidence coming from the real-world setup because of the limitations to any kind of studies. They did a lot of research. They published a lot of articles. I'm really encourage you to go on the website. it hasn't been really anything implemented yet, but they're still high level on discussing this, providing a data. We already saw this publication in the previous presentation, but they, for example, have published something. Okay, what are, let's say, registries we have currently in Europe? As you can see, only half of them are still active at the time of the publication 2 years ago. So there are registries, but as a manufacturer, sometimes you don't even know what real-world data is out there. So you have to be a little detective. Go around, talk to people, talk to your key opinion leaders, talk to your physicians. They might be aware of data sources that you probably haven't even thought about this yet. So final slide, looking a little bit into the future. What are we going to do? We definitely need more clinical data. We need more real-world evidence because of all the limitations of studies. We might get more registries in the future. A lot of EU member states, for example, have voiced an interest. They want to see more safety data because we still have a lot of safety issues with devices. We talked about all the different things. You might want to see more common specifications that define, at least for the European MDR, what type of data might be required. Artificial intelligence, well, we are just I think in the infancy of all the possibilities you might get in the future. In silico clinical data, that's something that's more discussed in theory right now, but we might be able to create some in silico models in the future that can mimic basically the large patient population. Smart devices, I think it's going to become more and more important. We're probably going to get more devices that have more, let's say, sensors collect additional data than probably we have now. So there's a lot to come. Very important is real evidence is there. It's here to stay. You just have to make sure, take a look outside, see what's available, talk to your notified body, talk to the FDA and see if they're willing to accept that type of data. But I was really happy to hear the previous presentation, how open notified bodies are now to see that kind of data. And as I said, it's gonna be here for, it's very important because we really need to see the data that really is happening in the real world environment, what happens to the patients in a normal hospital setting and not in highly specialized studies. And thanks for the interest. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to discussions later on.
Thank you, Matthias. That was a great presentation, and thank you, Dr. Yu. Great insight from both the EU perspective and the FDA perspective. Definitely FDA making more headway into the use of real-world evidence, and probably we'll see this is where the trajectory will be from the EU side to accept more real-world evidence once it's gathered sort of credibility across the in the US. So I'll probably start mine. Mine is more on the operational side of real-world evidence, right from the trenches. How do we capture that data? What data are we looking at? So let me just share my screen. Okay. So we are looking at obviously at cardiac data. So we are talking on cardiovascular devices. What data points are you looking at? Where are you looking at? And how to capture these data points? So eventually, this is where the main work happens. And what you put together, is it credible enough to push for a label expansion or push for a CE marking? So the way you collect this data and how you curate it is going to decide ultimately where your product stands. So I'll touch upon how to design a lean data map that fits your clinical claims, what data to collect, where you're going to find it, and how to capture it, how regulators judge the trustworthiness of registry data and real-world data. You have already seen how some of the notified bodies, as Dr. Yu pointed out, how they look at registry data. What are the points they are looking at when they look at a registry? Practical steps to make your real-world evidence plan regulatory ready. So I'll start off with a very simple example. So you know what is real-world evidence, you know what is real-world data. So how do you map this? So how do you map this to a clinical claim? So eventually you need to map what you're looking for. So you pick 2 or 3 priority clinical claims, list the exact facts you need to show each claim. So by a claim, I mean, so we are looking at a device such as a pacemaker with the remote monitoring. So it claims to, for people who use this pacemaker, there would be fewer emergency visits for slower heart rhythm. So that's a clinical claim. What are the facts are you going to look for when you look at this claim? So definitely you're going to look at number of emergency visits. And if they have visited, if it's a yes, what was the diagnosis during this visit? What was the visit date? And if a pacemaker was used, what was the model? What were the settings on those pacemaker? So then the next question is, where will this each fact come from? So the source would be the hospital record, obviously. So it happened at the hospital. Maybe the billing record, or could be the device log as well. So some of these pacemakers, you could monitor them remotely. And then you need to set the start date and the checkpoint. So you need to see what date the implant was implanted. There were checks happening at 30 days, 90 days, at what intervals the checks were in place. And then you need to delegate the responsibility. Who records these data? So it could be a nurse, it could be a data manager. It all depends on the delegation. So this is how you start off with an each claim and come to an endpoint on how this each claim would be collected. So what are the other sources for core cardiac data? So firstly, I've divided this. I know we have looked at all the settings, could be EHRs, hospital claim records, but an easy way to remember this would be where the procedures happen, where the results live, and where the outcomes are traceable. So where the procedure happens for a cardiovascular procedure would be electrophysiology lab, a cath lab, op theater, a hospital electronic record, or clinic record. Where are the results there? The results could be in separate systems. They could not be in the same system. There could be a pharmacy system. There could be imaging archive. There could be a remote monitoring platform, a laboratory system. So all these results would be residing in different places. So you need to look into each place for that real world data. And then where the outcomes are tracked. It could be the national or the specialty clinical registry. It could be the claims database. It could be the death registry or the civil registry, appointment or the scheduling system. So you need to look into each of these places and you need to source this data from each of these places. So what to collect by group? So in terms of the data, so for the patient, you need patient demographic data, you need some key medical history. For the device, you need the reason for the device to be implanted, the device model, UDI number. For the procedure, you need the access route. Then also the other data which you'd be collecting would be the visits, what was the care provided, the care provided in the form of discharge summaries, clinic notes. These are the type of data you would be looking for. What medications the patient was on, what tests were done, what imaging was done. You need all this data. So these are the real world evidence data. Say the patient was on wearables, so they had wearables. So what data would you collect from a wearable? Could be heart rate. I know there were some questions on wearables and SAMDs. So it depends on the type of data which was coming in. So it depends if it's only looking at heart rate and blood pressure or oxygen saturation without any impact on the treatment, then obviously they would be classified as wellness. So, and also the outcomes. So you need to see what was the eventual outcome. Was there a death, or was there a stroke, or any other reinterventions were carried out? So these are some of the data which you need to collect. And then you need to map which data set would come from where. So like a patient records would be coming from the electrophysiology labs, the cath labs. The visits would come from hospital records, so the clinic records. So eventually you need to tie these data sets to the data locations. So how are the regulators judging the registry data? So I know we touched upon the importance of registry and is gaining more and more voice in the real world evidence space. So IMDRF has come up with this tool for assessing the usability of registries in support of regulatory decision making. It's looking at other registries, looking at good governance structures. Are the devices being identified within these registries? Do the registries capture UDIs? And do they use recognized data models? Is it possible to link the registry data with data from other sources such as electronic hospital records, claims? So these are some of the things the reviewers are looking at when they assess the registry. So for orthopedic implants, we used to look at some of the larger, long-standing registries, such as the National Joint Registry from the UK or the Australian registries. So some of the registries which are more robust, they produce regular reports, and where you can tie the data sources, have more credible and more value compared to some of the lesser known registries. And also we talked about the individual implant registries which the manufacturer set up. So how robustly are they set up? and whether there are actionable reports being produced from these registries. I remember we used to have a manufacturer claim that they had a registry running in say Switzerland across 4 hospitals, and that was used to tie up all the PMCF data, but no report came from these registries. So eventually we ended up asking, can we see the report? If there are no actionable reports, then some of these registry data may not be useful. So I know we touched upon this FDA draft guidance, but what does it say? So FDA asks main 2 questions. Firstly, is the data coming from the real world evidence relevant? Does the data really answer the clinical question? And also, is it reliable? Are the data accurate, complete, and traceable? So these are some of the key things you need to keep in mind when you look at real world data to support your regulatory claim. And from the EU, there are different guidances which look at which state real world evidence and real world data. But the guidance remains still very fragmented, definitely showing a regulatory gap within the EU alignment. So I think the MDCG 2022-21 for the PSUR refers real world data from electronic health records and digital health monitoring devices, which you could see on page 26. This confirms the post-market real-world data are valid inputs to demonstrate ongoing safety and performance. So that's where the term has been concretely used. Also, you could see reference to indirect reference to real-world data in the MDCG 21-6, where registry data is being recognized, and in the 2023-3, the PMS plan template reinforces the need for continuous data collection from real use settings as part of the PMS system. So there is increasingly being reference to real world data and evidence, but there's no concrete guideline or a guidance document yet on real world evidence. So there are 2 parts to divide the real world evidence. One is retrospectively collecting the real world data and prospectively collecting the real world data. So what does retrospective mean? I know we touched upon it earlier. You look at existing data, which is already there. The data could be in electronic hospital records, could be from the claims, or data coming from the registries. But where does prospective real world evidence come in? So you might need to plan a PMCF activity following your CE marking, and that's where real world evidence data collection might come in. You need to plan how you collect the real world data. It could be from use of ePros, remote monitoring, or you set up your own registry. And how you collect this data is quite relevant, because the data would need to be credible and it would need to support your regulatory claim in the future. So how you design some of these registries and ePros is quite important. So how do you capture the real world evidence? So here I've touched upon there are different ways to capture the real world data. One would be conventional capture, trolling through paper forms and manual electronic hospital records entry, or you could use some AI tools. With increased advent of AI, a lot of tools have been developed. We saw in the chat there are a lot of tools being used for looking at EHR data, and which obviously will shorten the time. So you can see it can help with different aspects of the data collection. It could be for site feasibility, patient identification prior to a clinical trial. Another conventional way to capture clinical data would be data abstraction from registry uploads. So periodically you could output that data from the registries, or you could pull the data automatically at the point of care. You don't need to generate these intermittent registry data. Then also you need to separately look into imaging labs, pharmacy if you're doing it conventionally. But with the advent of AI and digital technology, the wearables and remote functioning systems can continuously feed this data and provide live stream of data. And data cleaning is another issue. So when you look at data in the retrospectively, the data may not be cleaned. So while prospectively, you can use AI tools and structures in place to clean data in real time. So it's more structured, and when the reports are generated, you could use these reports directly for your regulatory submissions. So there are different ways to capture real world evidence data. And I think with more and more tools being available now, I think I'll touch upon a tool which we have developed as well to collect real-world evidence data. How is AI helping? So I touched upon a few of these points earlier. So natural language processing models automatically pull endpoints such as readmissions, complication rates from free text notes, voice and OCR capture, looks at your consent forms, operator notes, discharge summaries. AI can automatically scan the UDI number. AI curation engines which flag missing data, suggest corrections in real time. So AI can be used quite effectively to collect real world evidence. So like I said earlier, now we have the tools, but do we have the rules? So you saw some of the rules earlier with the FDA and the MDCG guidances, but they're still not very clear on what would be useful for a real world data. So where the real world evidence is moving the needle in the cardiovascular space is more on the operational side of things. I think at the minute, but I think going forward, once the data becomes more robust, I'm sure there will be more and more regulatory submissions using real world data, especially in the post-market space. So at the minute is helping with feasibility of patient and patient recruitment. So AI tools can look at real world data, identify cohort of patients which may be from a certain region, demographics, lesser deprived areas. So you can use real world data to guide you on these indicators. Definitely help with site selection and activation, can help with patient retention, early safety signal detection. So real world data is quite important. You can safely see what signals are coming from which devices, which areas, and also, as you have seen, it has helped with label expansion for certain devices. Okay, so I'll quickly touch upon Milo, our in-house AI-enabled EDC platform to collect real-world evidence more prospectively. And so here you can see how Milo has a dashboard to give you real-time insight of your clinical trials happening over different geographic areas. So you can build custom analytics report right within Milo with real-time updates. Yeah, you will have real insight into adverse events, and the reporting is quite robust and happens in real time. So you will be provided real-time alerts about some of these events. So you can plan support to some of these sites. This is the Milo voice feature, which we have built in. So I talked upon voice and OCR capabilities. These are inbuilt within the Milo system. Here you can see the optical character recognition system, so which looks at data and pre-populates data on ECRFs, ePros, so which saves you a lot of time. Thank you very much. This is from a recent trip to Japan of Mount Fuji. So a lot of questions on use of real world evidence from our colleagues in the East as well. Feel free to scan the QR code if you're looking to try Milo, test Milo, and we'll set up a demo for you. Thank you very much. Probably we'll go on to the Q&A section now. So I think I have a few questions in the Q&A, and there were a few in the chat. So probably I'll address the ones in the Q&A. So the first question is more on the responsibility side of things. So while the manufacturer is primarily responsible for post-market data collection, collaboration with healthcare institutions enhances the accuracy and reliability of the collected data. So I think this question is more along the ownership of the data collection. Is it with the hospitals? Is it with the manufacturers? Happy for any of you to answer that. Matthias, what do you think? So the data collection responsibility?
Well, as I said, for regulatory purposes, clearly it's the manufacturer's responsibility. So the manufacturer has to make sure, because as I said, it's more probably relevant for Europe than for the FDA, because most devices, once they get FDA approved, you have to do the general PMCF or post-market activities. But in Europe, most devices, especially the cardiovascular field, since most of them are high-risk class 3 devices, need to collect post-market clinical follow-up data. And of course, this is the sole responsibility of the manufacturer to collect the type of data. Of course, he can set up, let's say, partnerships, sponsorships or whatnot with hospitals, with trying to collect the data, see what data they're going to have, he might be able to use. But the responsibility to collect the data and to provide them to notified bodies in Europe solely lies with the manufacturer.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that as well. Any different perspective, you?
Yeah, I agree with that point as well. So on the EU MDR, in general, we require general PMCF activity and the specific PMCF activity, especially for high-risk cardiovascular device. We might request a specific PMCF activity. It's certainly, I think, beneficial to collaborate with a healthcare institute to ensure the reliability and accuracy regarding the data sources where you collect the PMCF.
Excellent, thank you. So I hope that answers your question. So coming to the next question, this is quite an interesting one. So for the manufacturer's registry, so we're looking at a registry just devised by the manufacturer. When the endpoints deviate from the standard of care, how do you deal with consenting the patients? So like they talk about the endpoints, obviously, which are not defined or they are different from the standard of care. So this is more around consenting the patients to capture these endpoints.
I mean, normally, sorry, please
No,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I mean, normally there should be not that different from the standard of care. I mean, you look at the state of the art. State of the art usually is very well aligned with the standard of care. Yes, it could differ a little bit between different regions, between different countries in Europe, but the standard of care, the state of the art basically defines the endpoints. And this is always very important. I said this in my presentation. You always have to make sure, look at the state of the art, look at the endpoints you identified on similar devices, treatment options that are considered relevant that you need to present to the notified body, and then try to collect this type of data. Yes, I mean, it could be sometimes that's data that's not routinely collected in hospitals. Then the question is how much data is just like a questionnaire to get, let's say, a certain patient score. Can you probably rely on other data, let's say, that's collected in the hospital? But you also need to consider in the post-market clinical follow-up study, for example, and this is Article 74 of the EU MDR. If you do something that's burdensome or invasive, which is outside of the standard of care, let's say if you do an additional, let's say one example, you do an implant and you do an additional, let's say, X-ray or CAT scan, which is very limited, but still it's exposure to radiation. That's something that would need the consent of the patient. If you just, let's say, use the routinely collected data in the hospital and it's anonymized, there's no need that you need consent from the patients because most hospitals require patients to sign a waiver form anyway before they check in that the data is going to use anonymously for, and it's going to get used for other purposes as well, let's say insurances and whatnot. But yeah, at the end, I think this is not such a big problem because most of the time the state of the art and the state of care are very well aligned.
Yeah, I think that's quite clear. Would the database be provided by the manufacturer or could the hospital also collect the standard of care data and then transfer it to the manufacturer? So I think this is more along the lines of data capture. So the question is, would the database be provided by the manufacturer? So normally, in most instances, that's what I've seen. Is it the same with you, Matthias?
I think so. I said at the end, it really depends. I've seen manufacturers who use, let's say, certain regional databases or regional registries set up by hospital systems in the US, for example, and they're just basically piggybacked on that and say, okay, we're going to use the data and we provide some support or whatnot. It could be the manufacturer initiate this and then collaborates with the hospital. This is all different types of collaborations are possible. I said at the end, the manufacturer is responsible for the endpoints. He has to make sure he collects the endpoints he needs for his regulatory submission. So how this collaboration is going to be set up at the end, can be both as feasible as long as, let's say, the data quality and the data privacy is ensured.
Okay, thank you. So I think I have prepared this question for you. I think for under the MDR, as you know, new class 3 devices are generally expected to undergo a clinical investigation before CE marking. Given this requirement, how do you see the role of real-world evidence evolving? Do you see real-world evidence ever replacing or at least complementing a pre-market clinical investigation?
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, so this is about that real-world evidence collected outside of the EU geographic territory. So for the device that is already approved in another market, the real-world evidence is certain of value. But for the class 3 and implantable device following the Article 61 or is still a clear requirement that the clinical investigation is required. The clinical investigation itself can be performed outside of EU, in US or in Asia, but of course the quality, we look at the quality of the data, whether it's compliance performed according to the ISO 14155. And for the data that outside of the clinical investigation scope, that can be as a supplementary information, but primarily still the clinical investigation is required, unless, as I mentioned, the device belongs to this well-established technology list. But
Yeah.
of course, the good news, I think EU also realized that, for example, certain devices belong to class 3, also for transient use, has relatively lower risks. So those devices may be added to the wet list, let's say in the near future and perhaps at the end of this year. So
Yeah.
let's watch out this field as well.
We are really looking forward to this expanded, well-established technology list. I think is gonna make the life much better for a lot of the manufacturers and the regulators as well. There's one more question I think which I tried to answer in the chat. So this was more on the along smartwatches. Obviously, I think some of these it depends on the intended use of these smartwatches. So there was a question on whether these smartwatches which capture some of these data such as ECGs, are they medical devices? If yes, and what class of device are they? Matthias, do you differ from my comments there? I don't know if you had a chance to look in
No,
the.
I had actually had a chance to look at doing your presentation. I mean, of course, the smartwatch itself is a consumer product, electronics. It's not a medical device, but the
Yeah.
smartwatch could have certain apps or functions like the EKG, like a blood oxygen or so, that are considered in the US and in Europe as a medical device, or software as a medical device, or an app as a medical device. But that,
Yeah.
of course, need to undergo a conformity assessment to be aligned with the EU MDR. It's going to be a little bit challenging. I think the FDA 2 or 3 years ago published, let's say, an overview. They went through all the app stores and they found that 70 to 80% of the apps that claim to have some medical benefit, like, okay, we record an EKG or whatnot, never went to any process discussion with the FDA. So there's still a lot of unregulated things out there. A lot of app creators probably are not even aware that might fall under the FDA or EU MDR regulations. So
Yeah.
the problem really, I think, that with these apps are if they really, let's say, claim they can do something fabulous, which they cannot do, and patients rely on that, and it might at some point might want to harm at certain patients. Yeah.
Okay.
If I may,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
sorry, if I may add one point on this. So for EU, there is a specific MDCG guidance address this aspect. This is 2023-4 on the combination of software and hardware. So it says in general, the hardware as a general consumer products is not as a medical device unless it's a specific medical intended purpose.
Excellent. Yeah, completely agree with that. So there's one more question. I think we'll have time for one more. So if the data is collected in countries or territories outside the EU or the US, such as Canada, probably more for Matthias, but the patient population and study design are comparable to those in the EU, how will such data be evaluated and accepted for use in EU regulatory submissions? So sorry, I'm wrong. This is more for you then, I think. So the question is the data outside the EU or the US, such as Canada. So will that data, like such as the patient population and the study design, is it comparable to those in the EU?
Yes, that's a good question. So it's we always look at it device by device. It depends on the characteristic of the device, whether it's a device that has or the disease situation or the procedure significantly different per geographic region. And the manufacturer need to provide a good justification why it's can be extrapolated to the EU population, considering the medical practice, the disease, and the situation where the device is used.
Yeah. So I think probably I can add upon here as well. I've seen a lot of devices in orthopedic and spine space where the data was used was coming from the Far East, and there was a good enough justification. Have an experience looking at a survey exclusively conducted in one of the Eastern countries, and as long as there was justification, there was no site bias. The data was coming from multiple sites. So you look at some of the core aspects of a data and how the study was planned. So if that's planned in the right way, these data sets can be accepted for EU regulatory submissions.
Yeah,
And
and
maybe,
yeah.
Sorry, one more point to add for the orthopedic implants. For example, the size may be taken into the consideration. For example, it may used in the Asian population with a smaller size, and they're less used in the study with a larger size comparable with the EU population.
Yes, completely agree.
Yeah, that's something. I just want to comment because this is one thing where the EU and the US differ a little bit. We know we've seen from multiple notified bodies we've worked with that they accept completely pre-market studies conducted outside of the EU. But on the other hand, and I think this was also raised in the chat, the FDA usually expects, as I said, the FDA accepts data outside of Europe, but for pre-market applications for high-risk devices, they usually expect that a certain number of patients in that pre-market investigation is coming from within the US. They're a little bit more stricter that way, while in most cases the FDA is more pragmatic. This is one of the few topics where the EU might be a little bit more pragmatic currently than the FDA.
Yeah, completely. So all in all, thank you guys. Great presentations and great questions from everyone. And I hope we have answered all the questions just looking through the Q&A and the chat. So there are no unanswered questions. Thank you again for everyone joining in, and hope the presentation was useful. If you have any burning questions or anything we have not answered, feel free to drop us an email. We have shared our emails at the end of the presentations, and we will be sending out the slides and the recording of the webinar very soon. Thank you. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you.
Thank you. Great discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we can probably leave. Thanks.
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Then talk to you soon, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.